Afternoon. Today is Monday, Parshas Haloischa Chutzlaretz, Tes Zayin Sivan, and I welcome you all for this recording. I apologize for the technical problems which didn't enable me to give the shir on time yesterday, but what we can. Okay, so let's go straight to our questions. First of all, a parent is asking, they live somewhere in the northern region. Nightfall is quite late. The children have to go to school in the morning, and so the children will go to sleep, and it's still light outside. Question is, do we tell the children to say HaMapil or not? So what you have on the screen here is the Mishnah Brura in the Bir Halacha in Siman Reish Lamed Tes. So I'm going to read here, Avol Acha Sha'alu Alo Amud HaShachar. Once dawn has risen, Lo Mistapek Liklal, I have no doubt about that you shouldn't be saying HaMapil, that even though there are people who are sleeping at that time until sunrise, and therefore in halacha it's still called Zman Shechiva. It's a time when people do sleep in bed, as it says in the Gemara Brachas Daf Tes. However, as far as the bracha of HaMapil, Nira, it appears to me the Ovar Zman is considered too late, because you cannot say Hashkivenu after Alos HaShachar. It says in the Gemara in Daf Tes that although after the story with the sons of Rabban Gamliel, although that you could still say this nighttime Shema until sunrise, b'di'evet, but the brachas before and after Shema, you would be able to say Hamar Levarovim and Avas Oilom and Emes Ve'emunah until Goal Yisrael, but you wouldn't be allowed to say Hashkivein. The reason being because Hashkivena means kind of enable us to go to sleep. And after dawn, maybe there's a time that people are still sleeping, but it's not a time of going to sleep. And therefore, coming back from the brachas of Shema, as in part of Ma'ariv, coming to the bracha of HaMapil, which has in it the words Hashkivena L'Shalom, just Hashkivena L'Shalom. Now it's not, he's using his words carefully. It's not as man of tchilas shchiva. It's not a time of going to sleep. It's sov shchiva. It's the end of sleeping time. So meanwhile, what we have here is he's quite emphatic that HaMapil should be said only at a time when people go to sleep. So there is this question about people who work night shift. What do they do about HaMapil? And unfortunately, that is indeed the case, that the poskim say that they would not be allowed to say HaMapil in the middle of the day, because it's not a Zman Shchiva for most of the world. I would still, in our question, the child is 9 years old, let's say 10 years old, going to sleep, and we train them to say HaMapil before going to sleep. What are we going to do in the summer in the northern regions? I would say that the point being that you cannot, if there's an individual who is different to the rest of the country, then you would ignore that individual's specifications. But if it is a whole Medina, you're having the dinim of making juice out of fruit on Shabbos. So I think it says if it's a whole country where this is the norm, well, then that becomes something which we do have to take into consideration. So now with children, in this part of the world, this is the normal time for children to go to bed. Therefore, I think it is a Zman Shchiva, at least on the child level. You might argue, do we say that children is a different Roiva Olam? You could challenge me on that point, fine. However, sometimes we say, don't be mechanech a child, let's say, with a lemon, because, instead of an esrog, because they think when they grow old, oh, we can use a lemon. don't train the child to drink wine at the bris, which happens in Yom Kippur, because they may come to the illusion that, oh, wine from a bris you drink on Yom Kippur. So we don't give that wine to a child because they might carry and continue this. I want to just throw in something which is sad, but I think it's worth mentioning, that sometimes in summer camps, people use the men will use the swimming pool for a mikveh. So I've heard of someone who's not so learned who said that he can tovel kalim in a swimming pool. He's in a place where there's no regular kalim mikveh. Since in camp they go to the men use the swimming pool as a mikveh. Therefore, you could tovel kalim. Obviously, that's ignorance, but it's worth mentioning that this kind of, it's a real thing that people pick up. Coming back to our own instance, though, to say that because children will say HaMapil before going to sleep in the early evening whilst it's still light, therefore when they become bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah, and teenagers, they're also going to say HaMapil before sunset, so before dark. The reality is not that way. Teenagers don't go to sleep early. Brave. There might be a miyut. We discussed that last week, I think, about the choshesh of a miyuta. So, whereas other things they may continue doing so because that's the way they were trained, I think that's a far out concern. In addition, that we've got here a concept of chinuch, and for teaching chinuch, we would teach a child to say bracha even when it's not totally warranted, as you have in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Siman Reish Tesvav, I believe. And therefore, all in all, weighing up the various aspects, it is called Zman Shchiva. Even if it isn't, it could be it's counted as chinuch. Therefore, I would say that the children should be trained to say HaMapil. And by the way, HaMapil is also one way of stopping the children chatting after when they should be falling asleep. Okay, let's move on. Here what happened is that a shlucha had many guests on the second evening of Yom Tov. They made a late afternoon Kriyas HaTorah, and then they were entertaining the guests with a plan that it's going to come sunset, or the 18 minutes before sunset, they would light the candles. However, the conversation flowed, and they were distracted. It came to and it was like, instead of lighting candles at quarter to 9, the shlucha realized at 9:30, oops, we haven't lit the Shabbos candles. And obviously it was too late for herself to light. She had a waitress who was serving the meal, lots of guests. So she asked the waitress to light her candles, and the shlucha, said the bracha. So here the question is, number one, did she do the right thing to tell the maid to light it? And secondly, is there a consequence of having to light an extra candle in the future for having missed lighting? So just to add to the question, that since, of course, they had electric lights, so her lighting of candles was not so essential. And therefore, was it justified to call in and ask Goy to light them? So, looking at the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Siman Reish Samach Gimel Sif Yud Aleph, talking about whether it would be legitimate in the case of, let's say, there would be some event in the late afternoon, a Friday afternoon, and she would want to ask the goiter to light candles, and she would make a bracha when she comes back. So the Alter Rebbe says that she shouldn't do that because it seems to be out of order. That you're making a bracha sheket shana, which is normally a preamble to an act of a mitzvah, associated with an act of it, but you're not doing the act, and therefore, how can you say a bracha on someone else's act? That is the lechatchila, that we don't rely on this. However, then the Alter Rebbe continues. This is what we're going to read inside. As I say, it's Sif Yud Aleph. B'di'evet, if the woman forgot and did not light candles before twilight, and she realizes during twilight. Now, as we know, twilight is a Sophic Shabbos, and asking a goy is to drabonon, asking a goy to do malachas drabonon. So generally, there's a policy that you are allowed to ask a goy to do a malacha if necessary, if it is still twilight. So now, I mentioned 9:30. Seis HaGechovim was 9:40 on that date. And therefore, 9:30 was still Ben Hashmoshes. So she is allowed to ask a goy to light the candles then. And she would make a bracha before enjoying the light, as that's the reason for the women covering their eyes, so that they make the bracha prior to the act being not the lighting, but the act being the enjoying the light. Since the main mitzvah of Adlakas Shabbos is not the lighting, but is the benefit and the usage of the light, that's the main mitzvah. The lighting is a beginning, a start, a preparation for the mitzvah. Therefore, we normally make the bracha then at lighting. But this instance, we're talking about B'di Evet, she forgot, and she wasn't able, she did not make a bracha by doing the mitzvah. She may make the bracha at the beginning of the mitzvah, so to speak, which is the lighting. She's permitted to make a bracha before Iker HaMitzvah, which is the main of the mitzvah, which is the benefiting from the light. So that which one is allowed to, if a woman did not light Shabbos candles in time, and it's now Ben Hashmoshes, to call in a goy to light the candle, and she will make the bracha, the Jewish woman will make the bracha, that is legitimate. But let's read one more part. The instruction should be limited to a single candle, because a single candle, that's the main mitzvah. Continues. Now you're going to ask, what about the electric lights? But he says a single candle is permitted, even if there is already a Ner Dolog. There are other candles which are alight. It's not dark. And so this is lighting not for physical light as such, but more because of my personal mitzvah to light Shabbos candles. Since women are very particular with this bracha, so therefore it's considered a tzorech godel, it's considered a great need, which therefore it allows a shvus bebein hashmoshes, as discussed in Simulei Samachal. So should she have asked the goy to light a candle? Yes, but I would say, according to what we're reading here, only one candle. Whilst I'm saying this, if there are girls in the house, I think they would also be allowed to light one candle, because we're being matir here, because Nizhores Me'oid Bebrachazoi, very particular about this bracha, and therefore I think that would be legitimate even for each woman who would not want to miss out. Therefore, they would ask a goiter to light those candles and make their brachas, their candles, before opening their eyes to enjoy the light of the candle. Consequently, does she need to light an extra candle in the future? And I believe not so, because she has addressed, albeit belated, but she has addressed the duty of lighting Shabbos candles, so she hasn't missed, and therefore she would not need to light an extra candle in the future. Let's move on to our next question. So someone asks me, what's the difference? Well, their question was more that in the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe writes that the base of the word Lisatef B'tzitzis should be pronounced with a pasach. Base shel Batzitz is a Simon Chesed base, should be pronounced with a patach, Batzitzis, Latin Batzitzis. The pioneer, so his question was that in our Siddur, and Chabad Siddur, it has it with a Shavor. So he wants to know how reliable is it, the vowelizing in the Siddur, how authentic is it? But is it possible that we should? I mean, the Alter Rebbe says it's Shulchan clearly, should they with a pasuk, and the Siddurs with a Shavor. Now, I did confirm to the the fellow who asked, that the first two prints which I have, which was, I'm just going to keep to the Hebrew days because I don't handle English days very well. Tov Kuf Samach Gimel, we have that print, and that's just about 220 years ago. There it's B'tzitzis in the print Tov Kuf Ein Vov, which is 3 years after Alter Rebbe's passing. It's B'tzitzis. The later editions which I have, as in Tov Kuf Tzadik Beis, and Tov Kuf Tzadik Vov, and Tov Reish, I think Tov Reish Tezayin, whatever, those next three prints which I have, and Tov Reish Chomches, they have with a patach, as it is in the Shulchan Aruch. Later, we have in Tov Reish Nun Vov, I think, is the first print. No, there was an earlier one. The Rebbe's Elter Zayde, Rav Rom David Lavut. So he publishes a Siddur known to us as the Siddur Torah, and he was very punctual, very exacting. The Rebbe mentions this about him. He was tried to get things accurate. And so Rav Lavut, he in his Siddur, it's back to with the Shebah. And now he wrote, yes, I was going to say he was a pioneer in the research of the Alter Rebbe Siddur. And he first published a research under the title Shari Tefillah. Then later, his second edition of the same, with very significant input of the Rebbe Rashab, who was a very young man at the time, and it's called Shar HaKolim. We are going to too much details about that. We're just going to read a piece out of the Shar HaKolim. The Brocha Lit'atef B'tzitzis Habeis Shel B'tzitzis is Menukad B'Shvo. Although in the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Ches, the Alter Rebbe Paskins like the Mogen Avraham to say B'tzitzis with the patach. However, the Mukubolim, they rule according to Kabbalah and Alpi Dikduk that it should be with a Shvo. And I'm not going to go into the Kabbalah because I did not see this. He doesn't give very clear references to Kabbalah explanations on this. He refers to the Birkei Yosef for the Chidah and Machzik Bracha, which is a further addition, add additions to the Machzik Bracha, to the Birkei Yosef, the quote in the Sharet Shuvah for Reb Zalman Margolius. And the simple pshat is to wrap yourself with what? Do you wrap yourself with a tzitzis? You wrap yourself with a garment. Therefore, to say Lit'atef B'tzitzis would imply that you're wrapping yourself with the tzitzis, which is inaccurate. And therefore, you wrap yourself with a talus, which the talus has tzitzis. That is the pshat, and all right. So that's where it comes from. So we say Lit'atef B'tzitzis with a shvo, and it goes back to the Alter Rebbe Bismanoi, who published the Siddur. So whereas one could challenge whether every nikud in the Siddur of the Alter Rebbe is totally authentic, but this particular one has been authenticated by Rav Lavut, and we see where, when you see that there's a machlokas, and then you say, okay, so if there's a mistake, or there can be a mistake, everyone's human, but if there is a change, and you know that that change is an opinion of well-known poskim, especially if it's Mekubolim, then you have every reason to have the trust that that change was done knowingly because it's following those other authorities. Let's move on. So someone asked me about a woman, a woman who's within the first year of Chasana, and her husband has a sibling who's getting married far away in another country, long flight. Baruch Hashem, the lady herself she's expecting, and therefore not in a fit condition to be able to travel a long distance flight. And therefore the question is about her husband traveling without her. And it'll be for several days, make it as short as possible. Is that legitimate, or is there something about not traveling alone without your wife during the first year? So we are familiar with the Pasuk, which talks about when Yidden would go to battle, And there were announcements. Whoever has married and hasn't, which is the first year, would be exempt of going out to battle. Whoever had built a new house, whoever had planted a new vineyard. So these were exemptions from going to battle. So that's the basis of the Shana Rishon. So here's the question: is how rigid is that? Is there room for her to say, I'm okay with you going? So this, what you have in front of you, you can see it's from Shabbos Shevet HaLevi from the late Rav Vosner. He quotes the Sefer HaChinuch, where it says this mitzvah of Nochri beisoy, that a man should not go to the army during the year of his first year of marriage. So he says, included in this is not to go out of town, not for milchama, not for battle, nor for other things, for a prolonged journey, Yamim Rabu. And there, the chinuch implies, or says so clearly, that even if she forgives him, she allows him, that is not permitted for the husband to have. Well, I didn't notice this before. Even the minchas chinuch is saying Yomim Rabim. So a short trip, even the chinuch would be okay with. The minchas chinuch was a commentary on the chinuch. He challenges the ruling of the chinuch that even if she's moichel, it's not allowed. And he says that doesn't have basis in the Gemara nor in Rishonim, that the Isur of the din of Shona Rishona is even for other excursions other than battle. And actually, he says we have something in the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs. Does seem to say something in that way, in that direction. Yet in the Sefer Torah, Mishnah Torah, the Rambam does not mention this. So again, hello. Hello? I'm in the middle of a shit now. I can't speak. Sorry, Brian. However, so here we have the chinuch and the Sefer HaMitzvahs, which seem to say that he's just like he shouldn't go l'milchama, he shouldn't go for other activities either. Yet in the Rambam in Sefer Mishnah Torah, halacha does not bring that as a halacha, and therefore he says, "Lotzis l'schoiro befrat midaita." So when he's to be drafted, that is exempt, but to go out to do some business, especially with her consent, lo shaman, we haven't heard objection to that. And that's and as the Chassam Sofer says, that the chinuch is a yochid in this approach. And then the Chassam Sofer says, for a person to go out to do some business, to earn a living, is considered a mitzvah. And at least, he says, if she gives permission, then that's okay. For the husband to go for a tiyul, to go just touring, that yesh makom lahachmir that he shouldn't. So what we're seeing here is that if first of all, for a short period, very short period, because that's Yomim Rabim, yeah, I think even 3-4 days probably is less than Yomim Rabim in the context of an overseas flight. But then also we're seeing if it's l'soich mitzvah, and I think as a wedding of a sibling, probably if he just got married, probably close in age, that would be considered like close to a tzorich mitzvah, and if she's giving him her blessing, that's legitimate. Okay, let's move on. So here I've got a question from one who's running a Beis Chabad, and they do Ma'ariv early on Friday evening, because otherwise to have the Shabbos meal, which is a big aspect of many Bati Chabad, is to have a Friday night meal. To have it too late is going to be not very successful, and therefore they accept Shabbos early. They daven Ma'ariv early. So what about the people who didn't go to shul, live in this town, and there are Yidden here and there who don't come to shul? Are they bound by the early Kabbalah Shabbos of the shul? Number 2, is the Rebbetzin at home, the Shlucha? Is she bound by his early lighting, his early Kabbalah Shabbos? What do we do about, we have guests who are driving, they might arrive later. Then the fourth one is, we have a mikveh, there's a shliach in the next township who doesn't have a mikveh, he wants to use our mikveh. For some reason, he doesn't have a problem with a late night Shabbos meal, and so he wants to use the mikveh last minute and then drive home. So what's the story? So this, first of all, there is an idea. Well, first of all, there isn't a concept that when there is a communal acceptance of Shabbos, that's binding on the people in the community. That is the Pashat Halacha. You call it a din drabanan, but we've gone through this in the past a couple of times. The fact that some people who stay home might light Shabbos candles later. Now, first of all, I say that just like you're davening Ma'ariv early because you want to host your guests at a reasonable time, I have every reason to believe that those Shomer Shabbos in town are also interested in davening or being Mekabel Shabbos early and to have their Shabbos meal early. So the fact that you're starting Shabbos at 8 o'clock, the likelihood is that those people in town who are Shomer Shabbos are also going to be Mekabel Shabbos, not at 9 o'clock and have their meal at 9:30, 10 o'clock. They're more likely to start their Shabbos early. So I don't think there's a worry about a mikshel over in that way. There is a famous tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who says that the idea of it being binding on others is only if it's done l'shem mitzvah, not if it's done l'shem convenience. Now, here we have this quote from the Rav Moshe Feinstein. He's talking about husband and family relationship, but he also talks about a communal impact on the community, or the early Kabbalah Shabbos. He says, if it's done early, just that you should be able to have your meal early, it's not because of a mitzvah purpose, just for technical reasons. Therefore, your wife and family, etc., are not bound by you. That is, well, let's see, already addressing that. So Rav Wosner disagrees with this, and Rav Auerbach disagrees with this, and Shraga HaMeir, etc. Rav Moshe's a heter here was not broadly accepted by contemporary poskim. Therefore, let's go. That certainly the wife, the family should be accepting Shabbos early along with the husband. There is a bit of leeway, yes, because you have the heter of Rav Moshe. I want to say one very important point, that by the time the husband comes home, those candles should be lit and the table is set. It's all ready for Shabbos, for the Shabbos meal. I think I mentioned recently about the Malachim coming with the husband home from Shul, and when the Gemara Shabbos, and when they see that the table is all set and all ready, so then the good Malach says, so it should be next week, gives his bracha, and the negative Malach has to say Amen. So the idea that that she should not have to, now how long is it after Borchu until Borchu before Shema, until you finish davening? It's 15 minutes. So if I'm saying that the shlucha should accept Shabbos at the same time as they accept Shabbos, she should light candles just before they say Baruch Hu in Shul, accept Shabbos in Shul. I'm not talking about a lot of time. It's unless there's a long distance between one place and the other. But that is really something which should be recommended, that in the homes that they should be lighting candles before the time of Kabbalah Shabbos in Shul. The third one was about the guests who arrive later. Okay, so we should be telling our guests that we're going to be in Kabbalah Shabbos and this time. If they come later, so then, all right, they can rely on Rav Moshe. Okay. They've got something to fall back on. Finally, the fourth aspect of this question What about the shliach in the neighboring township who wants to use our mikveh? I think I've distressed this recently, but I think it's out of order that your people will come out of shul and see the rabbi from the neighboring town, but probably if he lives next to the neighboring town, they've probably seen him before, familiar face, and he's jumping into his car whilst they've already accepted Shabbos. It seems out of order, and therefore I would discourage it. Is he mamish bound lahalocha? Possibly yes, because now he is in this vicinity, so he might be bound by your Kabbalah Shabbos. The fact that he lives in another township, I'm not sure whether that's going to be enough, because at the moment the Kabbalah Shabbos is here. But maybe, we can argue on the halacha aspect. But I think the propriety of a Fruma Yid getting into a car where the local people have accepted Shabbos, I think that's the answer to that is obvious. Right. Now, someone of our regular listeners asks me, in the Rambam recently, there's a concept of, one of the Lamates Melachos, you're not allowed to put out a flame, and there's something called gram kibui, causing a flame to go out, let's say opening a window, and as a result, the flame is blown out. So he's asking about putting these floating wicks, which burn with oil, but you don't need to, for the amount of time you need them to be alight, let's say 3 hours, 4 hours, you don't need to fill the oil all the way from the top to the bottom. So you want to put, let's say, 1 centimeter of water, and then you put 1 centimeter of oil, and that will be enough for the evening. So is that legitimate? Because the assumption is that by the time when it burns down, then the water is going to be putting it out. So is that legitimate? So let's read. Actually, this is addressed clearly in Shulchan Aruch, and that is in Siman Reish Samachay. So we'll read that carefully. So the Alter Rebbe says here, Siftes, however, you are allowed to put water into a lantern, which is being lit on Erev Shabbos. And the purpose of the water there is to raise the oil level. Because you're not putting the oil there in order to put out the flame. And even, let's say, your intent is to put out the flame. Because if you leave it to burn all the way down, then what would happen is that the wick will start smoldering and it'll blacken the glass if you put it all the way down. Say the Alter Rebbe says that's not into consideration, and it is permitted, because it's not really a kibbutz. You're not putting the water doesn't put out the fire at all, because even if you hadn't put in the water, well, when the oil burns out, it's going to stop burning. So the water does not hasten the extinguishing of the flame. The water is serving only to raise up the oil level. And here's a motive that you don't want to spoil the lantern with a last bit of smoldering oil or something. All right, I'm not going to say the next piece because I don't fully understand it. But then he says further, if you have a wax candle, so wax candle retains its shape, it's not oil. And then you want to put water around, you have the same cup, but instead of one of those, you're filling it with oil and water, you want to melt a candle and stick it in place. But then you want to fill the glass with 1 inch of water so that when the candle burns down, so then the water will overflow and put out the flame. That's not okay. Because when the fire comes to the water level, then the water will gush in and extinguish the flame. Then that is not allowed, even if you do so before Shabbos, because that is setting in motion that the water will put out the fire on Shabbos. Having said that, he says that on an alternative, you, instead of putting water around the candle, you are allowed to put sand around the candle, and that will stop the fire spreading any further. And he says that would be, even if once Shabbos is in, that would also be allowed. Again, I don't want to discuss that, but So if it would be sand, somehow it's seen that sand will just prevent the spread of the flame, whereas water will overflow and put out the flame. So back to your simple question, that is definitely permitted, clearly. Like pause there, sorry about that. So I was mentioning that tonight is the yard site of Rabbi Sulak Alav Shalom. Now, there is a halacha here in Shulchan Aruch. It's a couple of times in Shulchan Aruch, in Ramot, actually, in the end of your day, which is the Din of Avelus, both in Siman Shin Sadik Aleph, and again in Tov Beis. So you have on the screen is from Tov Beis, that one should not participate in a Su'udah on the evening of the day of a yortzeit of a parent. So this is the question here. If I go to a chasana, to a wedding, it's actually of a close relative, and tomorrow is the yortzeit. So how do you say, the vertical lineage, the parents and the grandparents are allowed to go to a chasana of their child, grandchild, if it's there, even though they have for their parent. But here is a little bit further, like an aunt, etc. So there's no straightforward heter. There is this not going to a suda. Now, I think I've discussed this in the past, whether the suda is dafka wedding or even any other meal. There's Lashon of Shulchan Aruch is dafka talks about suda, doesn't say suda's chasana. In Nita Gavriel, he goes on to permit even. He says that's only a wedding meal, not anything else. But all right, so we do have this issue that participating in a wedding meal, which is not a child, a grandchild, etc., on the eve of a yortzeit would be an issue. What I have on the screen here is a quote from Nisha Gabriel. I'm sorry, I don't have the chapter verse. Well, it's verse 5, but which chapter it is, I don't remember. He says you would be allowed to go to a wedding if you're not eating there. So my suggestion is that the one who's asking this question goes to the wedding, and when it comes nightfall, they'll bench and not be part of having part of the meal. They can have other stuff later. That's not considered. I think only with hamoitzi, etc. That's called sitting for a meal. But if you're just having bits and pieces, not a proper meal, you'd be avoiding this child of joining in a suda. That's one solution which I'm suggesting. Let's move on. This is an interesting thing. So, Shlia, I don't know who asked me the question actually. Is there an issue of Bishul Akum with French fries? For those who don't speak American, is what we call chips in England. Is there a problem of Bishul Akum? So, I'm sure that one of the rules of Bishul Akum is only if it is the kind of food which would be offered al shulchan at a royal table. Doesn't that mean His Majesty, King's government, etc., in a high society? You would not serve chips at a royal or at a fancy banquet. Chips is the children's menu. It's when you're on the seaside, fish and chips. Yes, but the fish and chips is for poshter people. It's not elal shulchan meloch. The question here is the following: potatoes themselves can be served in a more fancy way. So are we going to look at the individual serving the way it is? Or are we going to say, well, potatoes are oil al shulchan malachim? Even that you can debate. But that's part of the question here. So this is where the struggle begins. This is in Siman Kuf Yud Gimel in Yudei, and we have here the Isur V'Heter. Isur V'Heter was one of the late Rishonim, very late Rishonim, and he says that there is a din of Bishul Akum for kishkas. And even though it says elsewhere that who eats kishkas, it's not a menschlich kind of food, and therefore it's not called a chaticha re'uya li'eskabed. However, it's also because of Bishul Akum. So let me explain this. There is a concept of when it comes to something mixed into 60 pieces of the same, so then you could say bottle b'shishim. But let's say I had 60, 70, 80 portions, quarters of chicken. And then one tray for a portion of, or one plate for a quarter of chicken got mixed into these 60, 70, 80 portions of chicken. Now, since a quarter of chicken, that's a reasonable portion. You'd offer a guest, you'd be able to cater, put down on their plate a quarter of chicken. And now, till now, you were only able to host 80. Now you can host 81. So then it's too obvious an addition to ignore. And because of that, the whole lot becomes awesome. That's the rule. A chunk which is fit for serving. If it's a full serving, then it doesn't become bottle. So there it says that kishka is not who serves a guest a kishka. And yet here he says it's going to come into the Isra of Bishul Akum. It is included in the Isra of Bishul Akum. Why? It's because it's choshev. Just 1 minute. Pause. 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 So here the Isra V'Heter is saying, although kishka is not called chaticha re'uya li'eskabed, but yet it is going to be considered a food which is going to be subject to Bishul Akum. So there's a bit of a contradiction here. And so the Aruch HaShulchan, you can see here, he's quoting the Pri Chodosh, saying that pukvik and kishkes, even though it says it's not considered a menshlich food, and therefore it's not considered chaticha re'uya li'eskabed. However, when it comes to the Isur of Bishul Akum, it is included. And kishka would be considered subject to Bishul Akum. Why? And he says the following. He says, we're not going to distinguish this meat and that meat. Otherwise, you're going to say, oh, lean meat is not choshev. Only rich meat, whatever, fatty meat is going to be a choshev. And you can't make that difference. And therefore, the whole min basar, we're not going to differentiate, and all types of meat are going to be also. Therefore, he's saying, although kishka itself would not be served as a choshev thing.
All from Jenna Karasik.
Sorry. Nevertheless, it is bottle. Nevertheless, it is also under. So here's coming up a new concept that because it's the same min, same species. So according to that, potatoes and potatoes. So even though French fries are not oil shulchan malachim, but because potatoes can be served in a fancier way, therefore they are subject. He's come up with this new idea that we're not going to limit ourselves to the specimen which is on the table, but we're going to look at the species. That is the opinion of the Aruch HaShulchan and before him the Pri Chodosh. And I have a sefer which is a rather specialist sefer on very much contemporary called Chelkas Binyamin, and he says that others disagree with this. And the approach is, and here he quotes it from Avnei Nezer. When it says that kishke is subject to Bishul Akum, is not because this expansion beyond because all the whole mean, but rather because it won't be served as a main course, but it would be served as a parferes. You would serve kishka as an extra, as a side dish. And therefore, you would serve kishka as you would invite a person and offer them a kishka. That would be the Ola Shulchan Aruch. So I'll explain something. Mashed potatoes is not a chadicha royalist carpet. Why? Because you want more, you want less. It's not a portion. Meat comes usually, chicken particularly, comes in portions. So you have so many portions therefore it's a chaticha royalist carpet. But the thing which you have a mass, let's say salad, it's coleslaw. There's no chaticha royalist carpet here, so you have a bit more, a bit less. You'll distribute to the amount of orchim. It's not as if you can now, I have another bit of coleslaw, I can invite another person. It doesn't work that way because you don't work with coleslaw by portions. So kishka would not be served as a portion, but it would be served as a delicacy, which would be as a side dish. And that's the answer why it's subject to Bishul Akum. So again, the Pri Chodosh and the Aruch HaShulchan are coming up with this idea that if it's part of a species, which part of that species can be is Ola Shulchan Aruchim, therefore the whole species is included. And no, they others disagree with that, and they say no, we have to look at that specimen. Now, this is true. But something, let's say, you can see here that they talk about, let's say, canned salmon, tinned salmon. So salmon is Ola Shulchan Aruchim. Would you serve tinned salmon? All right, but it's brought, and it could be, let's say, also it's in its current form, it's not fancy enough to serve al shulchan aruchim. You'd have to jazz it up a bit, but it is al shulchan aruchim with a bit of an enhancement. But once you've taken potatoes and you made them into French fries, they're not reversible. They can't be upgraded to become al shulchan aruchim, and therefore, according to those opinions which we're seeing over here, it's not al shulchan aruchim. I just want to add, let's say, another couple of points here. Let's read here. On the right is the Torah's Chatos, which is a compendium on the laws of food and kashrus of food by the Ramah, which is independent of his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. So he writes from the Tshuva about bread. Now, bread is, we've got the 5 types of grain, which makes bread. What about bread made of rice? So it's not considered pas, it's not considered bread, and therefore it doesn't come to the issue of pas akum. And he says another word, the Rosh, he's quoting the Rosh, he says, it's not Ola Shulchan Aruchim. So what about rice bread, which was made in a way it's more fancy? So the event is Ola Shulchan Aruchim. Yeah, if it's made more fancy, Ola Shulchan Aruchim. So they won't be also under a pas akum, it might be also under Bishul akum. Then he quotes here that the Issa Veheta says that rice bread, even though it's not Ola Shulchan Aruchim, but rice is served as a parferes. It's served as a side dish, etc. So the Ramah is disagreeing this very Issa Veheta, which was quoted, who says we're going to go and according to the species, not according to the specimen. Well, the Rosh disagrees with that, and he says rice bread is only going to be a problem of Bishul Akum if that rice bread is oil al shulchan aruchim. But if the rice bread is not oil al shulchan aruchim, the fact that rice is oil al shulchan aruchim doesn't matter. So all of this is leading us to this conclusion that potatoes, even if potatoes are oil al shulchan aruchim in a certain form, but in the current form, as in chips or French fries, they're not oil al shulchan aruchim, and therefore they shouldn't be subject to the issue of Bishul Akum. I just want to add to the mix something interesting. The Aruch HaShulchan himself, we just discussed, in a separate paragraph, addresses kartoffel, which is bulbas, these are Russian or Yiddish words for potatoes. And he says, I don't think potatoes are oil al shulchan aruchim at all. And if a goy had cooked potatoes just in water or baked them, a Yid would be allowed to eat them, of course, with a subject that's kosher in container, kalim and ingredients. And he says, who eats potatoes? Only the very poor people. They can't afford better food, so they're eating potatoes. But rich people, they will only eat them occasionally when there's so many in the market. Okay, so they'll have it, but it's not because it's a choshev of food. Then he says, but if not in the time when it's very, very abundant, other times of the year, they won't have it. Then he says, although I'm said that potatoes are not a choshev of food, I have found a Godel Echot who says, and referring to the Chochmas Odom Rabbi Ron Danziger, who's a parallel, a little bit later than the Alter Rebbe, then by that period. So he says that that potatoes are Oila Shulchan Aruch. So this is so interesting because he says possibly back in the day, the Aruch HaShulchan was a contemporary of the Tzemach Tzedek, younger perhaps. Back in the day, perhaps 150, 100 years ago, so there perhaps it was a new thing that potatoes are derived in the shores of Europe. Therefore, it's a choshev thing. It's only because this is only a new thing within the last century. So he says then it was possibly in the times of Rabbi Avraham Danziger, perhaps it was Oila Shulchan Aruch. But now they're planted to such so broadly, and it's a very simple food. The fancier people will say, "Zayhol, you bring me potatoes." He takes the view, but the potatoes are not a choshev. So on two counts, according to one approach is to say that we'll look at the specimen rather than the species. Then, and contrary to the Aruch HaShulchan, but even according to Aruch HaShulchan, who says we'll look at the species, well, then he himself says that potatoes are not a choshev of food. So on both counts, French fries would not be considered Oila Shulchan Aruch, and therefore there would not be an issur of Bishul Akum. Is there room to be machmir? Yes, because we're making cheshbonos. I once came to a shtetl, and one of the bar mitzvah boys asked me, "What's the dinner? Are Pringles? Do Pringles have to be Bishul Yisrael?" And perhaps my chassidish reaction was also Pringles. Isn't it? The lack of other foods with good hechsherim. So do you have to? You get here. You can get chips, potato crisps, with which are not Bishul Yisrael. If you're talking about a food that's a need, so there is a legitimate heter. To start saying that the heter, and therefore for using an Anash, where in Baruch Hashem we're living there's 10 varieties with good hechsherim, that you have to dafka use the ones which don't have a good hechsher. So then I would not take this that far. Right. Let's really have one last thing, and that is that last week's shir I spoke about making butter on Yom Tov, and I quoted the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tov Tzadik Hey that anything which is normally done in bulk should not be done on Yom Tov. Now, someone, Meir Zirkin, pointed out to me, thank you, Reb Meir, that the Alter Rebbe addresses this clearly in Siman Tov Kuf Yud Beis, and I'm embarrassed to say I had actually just learned it last week, but probably I was just half asleep because it was after lunch. So it says here, you're not allowed to set milk. What does that mean? Set milk? It means you'd put in rennet to separate the cream from the whey, etc. And that is a issue of boiler. You're separating the koim. I guess that's the part which which floats to the top from the whey, which stays to the bottom. Even though it's melecha seichel nefesh, it's dealing with food. But since it's normal to prepare to set a lot of milk in one go, it's in other words, it's normally done in bulk. And therefore, Chacham were concerned that if you would be allowed to do it on Yom Tov, you do it for other days also. So that's the same principle which we discussed last week. Then the Alter Rebbe says, for this reason, you're not allowed to make butter. And that is taken from the cream, which floats on top of the milk. So the younger generation don't know what I'm talking about when I say milk floating on top of the milk, the cream on top of the milk. But good old days when you got your bottle of milk for United Dairies or from Rubner's, and you had about 1.5 inches of cream skimming at the top, swimming at the top, and the lower was, and you have to mix it. So naturally, you got this separation that the cream floats to the top, and if you take off that cream from the thinner milk at the bottom, then you agitate it, you shake it for a while, then that's how you're going to make butter. So he says the separation of the cream from the the separation. Well, you're separating the milk, which means the thinner stuff, from the cream, which is going to be coming to butter. So there is an act of boyer. You're separating cream from whey, so to speak. If I got the words wrong, that's because I didn't learn English very well. And he says you're not allowed to even ask a guy to do it. And it says if you make cheese, so then it comes under boiner, because you're taking bits and pieces, little components, and you're making them into a mass. And so making butter on Shabbos would come under the issue of boiner. And so I believe that would also apply for making cheese, making into a mass of cheese would come into the issue of boiner. And I believe making butter, if the butter is going to be a solid mass, it would also come under issue of boiner. So I'm still curious why the Alter Rebbe mentions making butter is only under issue of boiner in Nechas Yom Tov, when there's also another aspect of it. So he says it's under boiner, where it should also be a question of boiner. Okay, so thank you for listening. And I'm sorry about all those interruptions. Usually I have other people here to man the phones. I'm just doing the recording on my own. I wish you a wonderful week, and we should share with one another in good health.